Hello everyone, welcome to a new episode of our vlog series. My name is Karol Rutkowski. I am a PhD student at the Center for Law and Economics at ETH, and I am very happy to be here today with Professor Manisha Padi to discuss her new paper about mortgage servicing rights. Manisha Padi is an assistant professor of law at the University of California, Berkeley Law School. In her research, she's been interested in the aggregate effects of legal treatment of individual transactions on broader systems, consumer welfare, financial institutions, and economy as a whole. Today, we'll be discussing her new paper, titled Capital Regulation and Asset Allocation Amidst Agency Conflicts. Evidence from Mortgage Servicing. Welcome, Manisha.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great to have you here. And before we dive into discussion of the paper, could you give us a short introduction to the paper, maybe some background, and why is it relevant?
Yes, so I'm going to talk a little bit about a uniquely American institution, which is the use of mortgage servicers and, in general, third-party debt servicers. So our system our financial system has become increasingly disaggregated over time, and many loans that are made to ordinary borrowers are separated from the original lender, and the interest in the loan is held by investors, a separate third-party set of investors, and the servicing of the loan is done by another separate third party, which is a mortgage servicer. And the result of this disaggregated system, this highly securitized system, is that the person you're working with as a borrower to make sure that you're making payments on time may not be the original lender for the loan and may be some entirely different party. And this mortgage servicer has a really important role to play, which is if you can't make your payment, they are there to help support you, work out a loan, make sure that you avoid foreclosure on your home. And on the contrary, the servicer has the power to start a foreclosure action and complete a foreclosure action. So in that background, in the setting of a highly disaggregated financial system, we start to ask the question of who exactly is holding mortgage servicing rights, and what effect does the allocation of these of servicing rights, meaning the right to collect payments, what effect does that have on borrowers, and what effect does that have on investors?
Great, thanks for the summary. So in your paper, you're building a whole new framework, trying to model the allocation of mortgage servicing rights. Could you tell us a bit more about the model?
Absolutely. So we try to model realistically, to the extent possible, the mechanism by which mortgage servicing rights are assigned to different servicers. Instead of being given to the servicer that may do the best job for the investor, who is the one who has an ownership interest in the loan, the way these rights are allocated is through a market mechanism. And oftentimes we think market mechanisms are very efficient. So if you just sell mortgage servicing rights to the highest bidder, that will result in the best outcomes for the rest of the parties involved and the investor in particular. What we document and try to develop a model around is to show that selling mortgage servicing rights in a traditional market has the potential to allocate servicing rights to servicers that have more conflicted incentives with the investor. So what I mean by that is a servicer who is compensated in a way that gives them an incentive to foreclose at a different rate than the investor would like. To be perfectly clear on how this happens, that's because servicers have a really important responsibility, which is that they have to make advances on behalf of borrowers that are in default, meaning that they have to make the full payment And that's costly for servicers. And so when they have to make a decision about whether to foreclose on a property or not, they face a very different problem than the investor would face if they were directly working with a borrower. So this misalignment between servicers and investors is something that we put into the model and show that the market allocation of servicing rights does not minimize misalignment. In fact, it could do the opposite and increase the misalignment between investors and servicers.
Okay, so in the next step, you build another model to look into the effects of tightening to banks' capital requirements. How do you proceed, and could you tell us a bit more about it?
So we use a natural experiment to study reallocation of mortgage servicing rights, and that is the introduction of Basel III's tightened capital regulation around mortgage servicing rights in particular. So this was adopted in the United States in 2013 and was first introduced in 2012. And the purpose of this rule was to appropriately risk weight mortgage servicing rights, meaning that when banks held this asset, they have to account for the fact that there is a risk of loss to them. The borrower could default, or there could be a prepayment, and they could lose that stream of payments that they expected to have. So Basel III introduced higher risk weights and limited the amount of MSRs that could be counted towards Tier 1 equity. To reflect this in the model, we show that when you introduce a bank capital constraint on how many MSRs, how many mortgage servicing rights a servicer can hold, they should change the allocation of servicing rights as a result. So in particular, we model two different kinds of servicers: bank servicers that are subject to capital requirement, and non-bank servicers that are free and unconstrained, but have a higher cost of capital overall, so are just, their business is more costly. We show that introduction of tighter capital rules around MSRs causes bank servicers to shed their assets and sell those assets to non-banks, and causing those MSRs to exit. And moreover, the model shows that the type of loans that are going to be sold by banks are, under certain conditions, the riskiest loans. So banks are going to try to sell loans that are given to subprime borrowers first before they sell loans to prime borrowers.
So you developed this whole theoretical setup, and it seems to be perfect for an empirical analysis. And indeed, you conduct some empirical analysis in your paper, and you look into the effects of Basel III regulation. Can you tell us a bit more about the analysis, and what do you find?
Yeah, so the beautiful thing about this setup is it's tailored very precisely to this episode in history that happens in 2013, the introduction of the Basel III mortgage servicing rules. And we are able to observe the equilibrium before and after this rule, and we are able to document several interesting stylized facts, as well as some causal stories around what happened when Basel was introduced. So the first set of facts are around transfer. So what we show is that just in the raw data, we can see that there's a spike in transfers of loans, particularly from banks to non-banks, around the introduction of the Basel rule. And then we use a difference in difference estimator to assess the causal impact of Basel, including controls, a host of controls and fixed effects. And we find that even within loan, we see an increased and sustained higher propensity to be transferred from a bank to a non-bank as a result of the Basel III MSR rule. The second set of results that we're able to show is that there's selection in this transfer, which is consistent with our model. We see that first, subprime borrowers' loans are sold. We also see evidence that loans that are in default are more likely to be transferred from banks to non-banks. And then finally, we take a step back and we ask the question of whether this move is actually good for borrowers or for investors, and we try to assess the welfare impacts of this change. And to do that, we introduce a little bit of structure around the problem of what is good for borrowers and what is good for investors. And we show that investors have an optimum foreclosure rate, meaning the propensity of the servicer to file a foreclosure action against a borrower who is in default. They don't prefer every default ends in a foreclosure because that's very costly for them. They lose a lot of money due to foreclosure sales, which are at a very discounted price. On the other hand, they don't want a zero foreclosure rate, investors, because that would mean that they're not recovering any of their assets, and there are people who are not making payments. So the investor's optimum foreclosure rate, somewhere in between 0 and 1. We don't know yet what that number is, but we show that the difference between servicers' behavior and in the investor's optimum, the difference in the foreclosure rate, is a sufficient statistic for investor welfare. And once we establish that in the model, we are then able to take this to the data and study what is the foreclosure rate that we observe that servicers, their servicers' optimum foreclosure rate. What we see is that non-banks are foreclosing much more often than banks. And we show that Basel III causes banks that are exposed to this treatment, or banks that, quick pause. Okay, so we show that loans that are exposed to the Basel III rule change are more likely to end up in foreclosure, and that the mechanism for that effect is likely through transfer to non-banks. And that effect is particularly pronounced for subprime borrowers. So the same subprime borrowers that are more likely to be transferred then are more likely to be foreclosed on. Based on those results, we're able to make a proxy for the investor's optimum, and we compare servicers' foreclosure behavior to what we think is the investor's optimum foreclosure rate. And we show that Basel III actually moved the foreclosure rates closer to the investor optimum. So investors prefer the higher foreclosure rates associated with the post-Basel period. However, a big caveat to this positive story is that we also show borrowers losing significant value due to this higher foreclosure rate, and particularly subprime borrowers who are already at high risk of financial distress and other issues. They are the ones that are experiencing large increases in foreclosure and potentially large losses that echo through the community, because foreclosure has impacts on neighborhoods, children, and a lot of other kind of innocent third parties. So our final results are around foreclosure and trying to give us a sign or a sense of the trade-off between welfare for the borrower, which seems to worsen after Basel, and investor welfare, which seems to improve.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. And now maybe last question. It is already about the effects of regulation, but what are the implications for policymakers?
So I think one really important general lesson we took from this exercise is that bank capital regulation, or in general, any kind of macroeconomic stability-focused regulatory change, which especially when it involves banks and not non-banks, which is the tradition in the United States, that bank depository institutions are regulated differently from non-banks. When you're taking those actions to make the banking system safer, there are potential spillover effects into the non-bank sector. And when you do that, there are real microeconomic impacts on borrowers and on ordinary individuals. So we started discussing this as these mortgage servicers as having a really profound role in borrowers' lives, and any of these shifts that are made at the regulatory level at quite a high level for reasons that are unrelated to the borrower-servicer relationship has very kind of strong spillovers on that relationship. And moreover, investors who are institutional players in the system are also impacted by bank capital requirements. So one important lesson we took from this is that there are these microeconomic impacts of macroeconomic regulatory changes.
Perfect. Thanks a lot for sharing your research with us, and it's great to have you here today.
It was a pleasure.
And yeah, looking forward to your further research in this area and work in this area. And to our vlog listeners, thank you all for being with us today, and we hope that you enjoyed the episode as much as we did, and hopefully see you again next time.